He sold $35 million of fake wine in a single year from his kitchen. Not from a winery, not from a warehouse, from a house in Arcadia, California, where bottles of cheap Napa Red sat on the counter waiting to become something they were never going to be. The question this video answers is how one man fooled the most knowledgeable wine buyers on earth for nearly a decade, and why the thing that finally stopped him was not a laboratory test, but a phone call from a winemaker who simply knew his own history. Rudy Kurniawan arrived in the fine wine world sometime in the mid-2000s, and he arrived fast. He was Indonesian-born, living in the suburbs of Los Angeles, and he had two things that opened every door in the collector community: an extraordinary palate and an apparently bottomless appetite for the most expensive Burgundies on earth. He became obsessed above all with Domaine de la Romanée, Conti, the small Burgundy estate whose wines are, by most measures, the most sought after on the planet. A single bottle can sell for tens of thousands of dollars. Collectors call it DRC for short. Kurniawan's immersion in it earned him a nickname, Dr. Conti. And in the world of fine wine, a nickname like that is currency. He was not just buying, he was tasting blind at the highest level, identifying vintages and producers with a precision that earned him the respect of people who had spent decades in the trade. Experienced collectors sought his company. Auction houses took his calls. The wine world is small, and inside it, Rudy Kurniawan had become someone you trusted. That trust was about to become a mechanism. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, beginning as early as 2004, Kurniawan was running a counterfeiting operation that was systematic and deliberate. Here is how it worked, in plain terms. He sourced genuine empty bottles from the world's most desirable estates. He blended cheaper, newer wines together to approximate the taste profile of what was supposed to be inside. He filled those genuine bottles with the blends, forged the labels with considerable care, resealed them with corks, and sold them as authentic through auction houses and private sales. The reason this worked is structural. The rarest old wines are almost never opened at the point of sale. They trade on provenance, on documentation, on the reputation of the seller. When a celebrated taster with a track record of identifying great wine offers a bottle, the buyer has almost no incentive to open it and ruin it, and almost no practical means to test it without destroying it. Kurniawan's social credibility was the authentication. The auction house that handled his most significant sales was Acker, Merrill & Condit, one of the most prominent wine auction businesses in New York. In 2006, Kurniawan consigned wines through two separate Acker sales. The first brought in $10.6 million. The second brought in $24.7 million, a record for a single wine auction at the time, beating the previous record by more than $10 million. Across 2006 alone, his bottles sold for roughly $35.3 million. Those figures were not just commercial results. They were the kind of numbers that made the entire fine wine world stop and pay attention. But there was a detail in the 2006 aftermath that most people did not dwell on. Kurniawan defaulted on a $10 million loan from Acker, Merrill & Condit. The man who had just broken every auction record in the market could not cover the loan. That is the detail that, in hindsight, tells you the whole shape of what was happening. So far, Kurniawan has built a reputation as the finest taster of his generation, sold roughly $35 million of wine in a single year, and defaulted on a $10 million debt to the house that sold it. What happens in 2008 is where the structure begins to crack. In April of 2008, Kurniawan consigned a group of bottles to auction that were purportedly from Domaine Ponsot, a well-regarded Burgundy estate. The bottles claimed to be Clos Saint-Denis Grand Cru, with vintages ranging from 1945 to 1971. Laurent Ponsot, the head of the domain, saw the lot listing. He contacted the auction house directly. His message was straightforward. Domaine Ponsot had never produced a Clos Saint-Denis before 1982. Every bottle in that consignment bearing an earlier vintage was an impossibility. The lots were pulled before the sale. Ponsot did not stop there. He became a public and relentless advocate for exposing what he believed was happening. And the wine world, which had been largely insulated from scrutiny by its own insularity, began to pay a different kind of attention. Billionaire collector Bill Koch had by this point purchased bottles he later suspected were Kurniawan fakes. Koch filed civil suits and became one of the most vocal public voices pushing for a criminal investigation. The pressure was building from multiple directions. and Kurniawan had no way to know exactly when it would arrive at his front door. On the morning of the 8th of March 2012, FBI agents did. They arrested Kurniawan at his home in Arcadia, California. What they found inside was not a wine cellar. It was a production line. Inexpensive Napa wines with handwritten notes indicating they were to be passed off as older Bordeaux vintages. Corks, stamps, labels. The materials of an operational forgery laboratory sitting inside a suburban house. The DOJ alleged the scheme had been running continuously from 2004 through 2012. In December of 2013, after a one-week jury trial before U.S. District Judge Richard Berman in the Southern District of New York, Kurniawan was convicted on charges of wire fraud and mail fraud. He became the first person in United States history to be convicted for selling counterfeit wine. In August of 2014, Judge Berman sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison. He was ordered to forfeit $20 million and to pay $28,405,502 in restitution to his victims. That restitution figure was, at the time, the largest ever ordered in a U.S. wine fraud case. The human cost was not abstract. The buyers who paid for bottles they believed were among the finest ever produced, who stored them, who built collections around them, who in some cases staked their reputations on them, had been sold something that had never existed. Kurniawan was released from federal prison in November of 2020 and was subsequently deported to Indonesia. And here is where the story does not end cleanly. Wine experts and investigators have stated publicly that an unknown number of his counterfeits are believed to remain in private collections and on the secondary market today. The buyers do not necessarily know. The bottles have not necessarily been opened. The full scale of harm may never be precisely calculated, because the market that made Kurniawan possible, one built on trust, on reputation, on provenance documents, on the social authority of a celebrated taster, is also the market that makes it hardest to ever fully audit the damage. The thing that brought him down was not technology. It was not a forensic test or a regulatory audit. It was one winemaker in Burgundy who simply knew that a vintage listed on a bottle had never existed, because he knew his own family's history. The lesson is uncomfortable for anyone who operates in any market built on expertise and trust. The same conditions that make a market prestigious are often the same conditions that make it vulnerable. The thinner the paper trail, the harder the asset is to test. The more the price depends on who is selling it, the more attractive that market becomes to someone willing to manufacture the one thing that cannot be bottled: credibility. So here is something to sit with. If you had bought one of those bottles, paid a serious price for something you believed was irreplaceable, and you later discovered it might be a fake, would you open it? Would you have it tested? Or would you leave it in the cellar because part of you would rather not know? That is not a hypothetical for some collectors. It is the situation they are in right now. If you want to understand more stories about the systems that allow fraud to operate in plain sight, subscribe.